Welcome to VSOW. Today, we are embarking on a deep dive into a topic that, well, it really forces us to confront the uncomfortable intersection of high technology, resource scarcity, and some of our oldest, deepest cultural taboos.
Exactly. Our mission today is precisely that, to take this stack of pretty challenging source material and really unpack how technological ambition and these population anxieties are bumping up against ethical, cultural, even biological prohibitions that have defined human civilization for, well, millennia.
And we are drawing insights from a truly comprehensive analysis today. This includes, groundbreaking discussions around cultivated meat,
Yeah.
right down to the genuinely unsettling concept of lab-grown human cells.
Right. And also looking at sociological critiques of modern dystopian fiction, like The Purge, the kind of harsh realities of the alternative protein industry's corporate pivot.
And finally, a really profound look back at historical population crises through the, frankly, brutal lens of Malthusian theory, especially concerning Jonathan Swift's savage satire, A Modest Proposal.
Yeah, we're basically examining how both history and imagined futures hold mirrors up to our current values, and how our society reacts when these stress points push us toward, let's say, ethical extremes. It means we really need to dig into the details underpinning these huge concepts.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Starting with a concept so bizarre, it seems lifted directly from maybe the darkest corner of science fiction. We have to talk about the literal taboo of cultivated meat derived from human cells.
Okay, so to ground this, we probably need to understand the fundamental science of cultivated meat, or CM, as it's often called. It's essentially biology, but, in a factory setting.
Right.
It starts by sourcing animal cells, usually through a tiny, pretty non-harmful muscle biopsy from a living animal. Or, in more advanced research, scientists might use induced pluripotent stem cells, iPSCs.
Which are adult cells reprogrammed back into an embryonic-like state.
Exactly. Or they might use genuine embryonic stem cells, ESCs. So those are the basic starting material.
So these are the fundamental building blocks, right? But then you need to scale them up.
Yeah.
Dramatically.
Precisely. These cells are then placed in these vast containers called bioreactors. They're fed a nutrient-rich serum, typically a mix of salts, sugars, growth factors, that kind of thing, and they just multiply exponentially.
Okay.
Then they're guided to differentiate. That just means they turn into specific tissues like muscle and fat cells. The really key thing is that this all happens in vitro, outside of the animal's body.
And the structure. Because you can't just have a sludge of cells, can you? You need something that actually resembles, say, a steak or a meatball.
That's where the scaffold comes in. It's crucial. The cells need something physical to cling onto and grow around.
Yeah.
This scaffold could be, say, a decellularized animal material, maybe a synthetic polymer, or increasingly they're using plant-based material.
Oh, okay.
And that gives the final product its structure, whether it ends up as a nugget or maybe a strip of more structured tissue like you'd expect.
Okay, so that's the basic science. Now we dive into the really shocking material that came from our sources. The claim by a company actively researching lab-grown meat from human cells, who insisted that eating their product means you are technically not a cannibal. That phrase, technically not. It's doing a tremendous amount of ethical heavy lifting there, isn't it?
It really is. And that's exactly where the linguistic and ethical gymnastics start. The scientific argument, stripped down, is rooted entirely in the definitions of consumption and harm.
How so?
Well, since the cells were presumably donated voluntarily, and the meat itself is grown and replicated outside the human body without consuming the actual donor, proponents argue the strict definition of cannibalism, the consumption of another living person's tissue, is sidestepped.
So you're consuming biological material, human biological material, but not technically an individual person.
That's the argument. But of course.
But doesn't that scientific loophole just, fail entirely when you set it against thousands of years of really deep-seated cultural food prohibition? This isn't just about biology, is it? It's about cultural identity, the sanctity of the human form, things like that.
That is the absolute core conflict here. Technology has, you could argue, moved faster than morality. It challenges whether the taboo is against the act of killing and consuming a human, or if it's simply against the material itself, regardless of source.
Right.
And, as we saw in the sources, the public imagination immediately leaped to the most, absurd and transgressive marketing angles you could think of.
Oh, yeah, we saw Reddit users discussing this whole concept and suggesting, totally leaning into the taboo, half-jokingly coining terms like ethical cannibalism or creating custom orders specifically designed to provoke, really specific stuff.
Indeed, the dark humor around it was just immense. Commentators immediately moved past, utilitarian food supply and straight into customized, highly personalized consumption. We saw suggestions for these really niche high-end products.
Like celebrity meat.
Exactly.
Right.
Imagining vat-grown celebrity-themed dishes, the idea of ordering a Momoa filet mignon or maybe an Ivanka rump roast. It turns the consumption of the wealthy or famous into this bizarre, literal form of high-tech eat-the-rich fantasy.
Wow. It sounds like a bioengineered way to channel public resentment, almost. Hashtag 1.2 ethical and moral gymnastics of lab-grown human meat.
And this immediately forces us to look at the ethical arguments the proponents are making. Given that humans can provide informed consent for cell donation, a choice obviously not available to animals. Some argue this cultivated product is, by definition, actually highly ethical.
The utilitarian view seems quite powerful there. If no human or animal died and the end product is functionally meat, then maybe meat is meat.
That's the clean line, yes. But it completely ignores the sort of visceral cultural recoil. However, there's a fascinating, almost paradoxical health advantage that commentators brought up. It moves beyond just ethics into pure biological safety, avoiding prion diseases.
Prions. Right, explain that connection.
Okay, so a prion is basically a misfolded protein. The dangerous thing is it can cause other healthy proteins, mainly in the brain and nervous system, to also misfold. This leads to fatal neurodegenerative diseases. Think mad cow disease in cattle or CJD in humans.
And what does that have to do with traditional cannibalism?
Well, in traditional human cannibalism, especially where cultural practices involved eating spinal or brain tissue, there's a known risk of transmitting these prions.
Yeah.
The most notorious example is Kuru disease,
Where was that found?
primarily spread through ritualistic consumption of the deceased among the Fore people in parts of Papua New Guinea. Kuru is incredibly rare today, thankfully, but it has this frighteningly long incubation period, sometimes 10, even up to 50 years.
50 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So lab-grown human meat, which would be engineered muscle and fat tissue grown in a totally controlled environment, would completely sidestep the ingestion of nerve tissue. And therefore, it would eliminate that specific biological risk factor inherent in consuming actual human remains.
That really shifts the discussion, doesn't it? It moves from, this is disgusting, to, well, this is arguably safer than real human consumption, which is quite a thought.
It is.
And then we hit the ultimate philosophical boundary, maybe, the vegan paradox. The claim, made by one observer, is that if you were to grow and consume meat derived from your own cells, it would be technically vegan.
That is the ultimate edge case, isn't it? Because the definition of veganism centers on avoiding the exploitation and use of animals for food, clothing, or other purposes.
Right.
So if the cells are human, and they're your own cells, then by a very strict, literal interpretation, no animal was involved or exploited. It just strips the ethical debate down to its bare components. It forces you to ask where the lines of self-consumption and identity truly lie.
What's fascinating here is just the sheer speed with which technology can potentially render thousands of years of cultural prohibitions, well, maybe not meaningless, but at least subject to legal and technical negotiation. This whole discussion forces us beyond the typical animal ethics debate, right into the very core of what defines human food and human culture.
It really does. It pushes boundaries we probably never thought needed pushing.
Okay, so moving from those ethical extremes to the industrial reality, the cultivated meat industry itself has followed a pretty textbook technology hype cycle, starting decades ago, apparently.
Yeah, if you trace the history, the initial technology trigger wasn't some flashy startup. It was actually government research. NASA began exploring tissue engineering way back in the 1950s and 60s.
For space travel.
Initially, yes, for long-duration space missions. They were hoping to find a way to provide food without needing complex livestock systems on board. This was then followed by some crucial early patents in the 1990s, particularly ones secured by Willem van Eelen.
But the moment the hype really ignited what they call the peak of exaggerated expectations, that was 2013, wasn't it? That was the year Mark Post unveiled the world's first cultivated burger.
That's the one. Grown from cow stem cells, famously costing an absolutely astounding $330,000.
Funded by Sergey Brin, the Google co-founder.
Right. That single event really drove the narrative of cellular agriculture, a term actually coined a couple of years later in 2015. The vision was incredibly ambitious back then. This was positioned as a truly disruptive technology. It was going to lead to an animal-free future. The whole narrative was saturated with these very high normative goals: ending slaughter, promoting justice, environmental sustainability, animal rights. It was genuinely hailed by proponents as a moral and industrial revolution.
And the high point of that vision seemed to materialize fairly recently, in December 2022. That's when Eat Just's cultivated chicken received the world's first regulatory approval in Singapore.
Exactly. That felt like a huge moment. It signaled that the technology was finally, potentially, moving from the lab bench to the dinner plate. However, almost immediately following that first regulatory approval, the industry seemed to plunge headlong into the inevitable next phase, the trough of disillusionment.
Right. Characterized by intense corporate scrutiny and significantly major regulatory pushback across the globe.
Yeah. Let's look first at the criticism coming from within the advocacy and environmental spheres. Some critics argue that CM actually fails to achieve genuine systemic change because it just perpetuates the meat paradigm.
What do they mean by the meat paradigm?
Well, this criticism suggests that CM doesn't really question the deeply ingrained cultural need, or maybe just desire, for meat consumption in the first place, instead of encouraging consumers to shift towards plant-based options.
Which are already growing in popularity.
Right. Instead of supporting that shift, CM just offers a new technological fix, a workaround, if you like, that enables the continuation of the same consumption status quo. Critics argue this diverts billions in funding away from promoting vegan or plant-based alternatives. It changes the source, perhaps, but not the fundamental demand.
Okay, that's one angle. And then there's the maybe even more potent critique concerning corporate control and power. The idea was this could be a decentralized ethical industry.
But the reality is shaping up differently. The market for alternative proteins, including CM, is rapidly being consolidated, even monopolized, by the established protein giants. Tyson, Nestle, Cargill, JBS, the big players.
And the money behind them.
It's crucial, yeah. When you track the investment, this centralization of power is heavily financed by major, often quite opaque, financial players like BlackRock and Vanguard.
Oh.
For critics, this just confirms that CM isn't really a sustainability solution first and foremost.
It's business.
It's simply becoming a new industrial source of profit. It allows these incumbent corporations to maintain control over the global food supply, regardless of whatever ethical window dressing is applied. It looks like an industrial play before it's a climate play.
And this disillusionment, the skepticism, it manifested very tangibly through actual regulatory bans, didn't it? A major public backlash against the technology. Italy led the charge with Law N.172/2023.
They did. Italy banned the production and commercialization of cell-cultured food and feed entirely. Now, the stated goal was, protecting traditional agriculture and national food identity.
Which sounds reasonable on the surface.
But the sources suggest the move was heavily fueled by misinformation and a kind of generalized political mistrust in large supranational bodies, like the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA. People were skeptical of the EU generally, and by extension, any novel food approved by its agencies seemed suspect.
So it was partly political pushback against the EU itself.
It seems so. This skepticism was apparently so strong that Italy, along with France and Austria, backed by 9 other EU delegations, actually declared CM a threat to primary farm-based approaches.
Wow. And we're seeing that same kind of protectionist reaction now in the United States too, right? In 2024 and into 2025, states like Florida, Arizona, Tennessee, they've passed similar laws banning the production or sale of cultivated meat.
Yes, these U.S. bans seem to share the same underlying motivation: protecting traditional farming interests and expressing consumer safety concerns, even though the USDA and FDA had actually approved 2 companies for sale in 2023.
So the science might be moving forward, but the politics and economics are pushing back hard.
It really shows that no matter how technically sound the science might be, if it threatens established economic and cultural power structures, political tools will absolutely be deployed against it.
So how does the industry respond to this massive backlash, this trough of disillusionment? We see a shift apparently towards what's termed the path of enlightenment, focusing on a broader category, alternative proteins.
Correct. The debate starts to pivot away from focusing just on CM. It moves toward a more holistic approach that includes CM, yes, but also plant-based options, fermentation-derived proteins, even insects.
And this is reframed by big international bodies.
Yeah, major players like the IPCC, the WHO, the EU Commission, they start talking about it in terms of complementarity rather than opposition. The stated goal becomes simply reducing overall meat and fish consumption through a diverse range of sources, not necessarily eliminating meat entirely.
And this leads directly to the industry's current and arguably quite quiet strategy heading towards the plateau of productivity, characterized by silent reformulation and discrete branding. What does that actually mean in practice?
It means making fundamental changes to the food system, but without causing consumer panic or resistance. So companies are quietly replacing animal-based ingredients in common household products, things like mayonnaise, soups, packaged desserts, maybe cakes.
Things you buy all the time.
Exactly. They're swapping in plant-based or other alternative protein components, but crucially, without upfront consumer labeling or communication that screams vegan or plant-based.
So they are prioritizing taste and price, maybe texture, and making the ethical or environmental transition basically invisible to the average shopper.
Precisely. As one expert in the sources observed, people's lives are complicated enough. They don't necessarily want to think deeply about sustainability or ethics every single time they buy a jar of soup. The
Mhm.
quieter companies can make this transition, the argument goes, the easier it is for mass consumer adoption.
So they're kind of nudging consumers toward a more sustainable baseline without forcing a disruptive change in their purchasing habits or making them feel like they're sacrificing something.
That seems to be the strategy. And the ultimate goal of reaching this plateau isn't necessarily presented as, environmental salvation. It's framed with a very defined financial metric.
Which is,
The focus is now highly industrialized and clearly profit-driven. We see this in the shift towards measuring the impact return of the capital employed. This isn't an appeal to morality. It's a financial key performance indicator, a KPI.
so translating environmental benefits like emission savings directly into a financial justification for the industrial investment.
Exactly. The vision driving this phase seems to be much more about industrial transformation and market share rather than fundamental systemic or cultural change.
Okay, that pivot from these really high ideals down to silent, profitable industrial control that provides a powerful bridge to our next section, I think. If technology is maybe offering us a silent escape from the ethical debate, perhaps we need to look back at history to see what happens when scarcity isn't managed silently, but brutally. And that brings us squarely to the roots of resource scarcity, anxiety, Malthusian theory. Hashtag tag 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 3.1 Malthusianism and the tragedy of Ireland.
Right. The Malthusian catastrophe, as defined by Thomas Malthus back in the late 18th century, posits this grim, seemingly inevitable cycle. Human population tends to grow geometrically, doubling and redoubling, while agricultural output only increases arithmetically, like adding a fixed amount each time.
So eventually, population growth just outstrips the available food supply.
Exactly. Leading to what Malthus called positive checks, things like plague, famine, or war that increase the death rate, or alternatively preventative checks, things like abstinence or delayed marriage that lower the birth rate.
And the historical reality of this Malthusian trap is, well, savagely eliminated by Jonathan Swift's 1729 satire, A Modest Proposal. Just to remind listeners, Swift's shocking suggestion was to sell the children of the Irish poor to the rich for meat.
Yeah, and it's absolutely crucial to understand Swift was not genuinely advocating cannibalism. It was bitter, deeply savage satire. He was railing against the political and economic policies of the English Parliament and the Crown, which were systematically exploiting Ireland and driving its people into poverty.
How did that exploitation specifically create a Malthusian trap for the Irish poor? What were the mechanics of it?
Well, the English Crown actively promoted what's called forced mercantilism. They systematically plundered Ireland's massive livestock wealth. The sources note that by the 1760s, Ireland was exporting up to 213,000 barrels of beef annually.
Huge amounts.
Massive. Yet only a tiny fraction of that, maybe around 1%, was actually available for domestic consumption by the Irish people themselves. Furthermore, while pork exports to Britain were basically non-existent earlier, they rose to dominate. By the 1800s, something like 87% of all Irish pork was heading across the sea to Britain.
So the Irish peasantry were living in a land incredibly rich in resources, particularly protein, that were being actively shipped out, denying them access to these staple foods.
Precisely. And at the same time, landlords, who were mostly Protestant and operating under English policy favoring them, forced their largely Catholic tenants to rely almost exclusively on the potato.
Why the potato?
Well, the potato is very high yielding, it's perfect for small plots of land, and it provides enough caloric density to sustain and even encourage large families, which, conveniently for the landlords, supplied a ready source of cheap farm labor.
So this created an abnormal overpopulation among the poor, completely reliant on a single crop.
Exactly. It set them up perfectly for the inevitable Malthusian catastrophe that would later manifest as the Great Famine or the Great Hunger, when the potato crop failed due to blight.
And Swift's cruel satire was aimed specifically at this hypocrisy.
Absolutely. His modest proposal ridicules the landlords who had, in effect, already devoured most of the parents through exploitation, crippling rents, and economic starvation. He was essentially saying, since the ruling class is already metaphorically eating the Irish people through these brutal policies, why not make it literal? And he was also tapping into and, ridiculing these racist English beliefs that the Irish were somehow primitive and anthropophagus, cannibals. They often referred to the Irish poor in derogatory terms like human swinery.
It connects resource scarcity directly to class warfare, where the poor become disposable. That is a truly horrifying historical precedent for some of the dystopian fiction we consume today, isn't it?
It really is. The parallels are quite chilling when you draw them out. And that historical link, that connection between resource scarcity and class warfare, is arguably why the premise of the modern film series The Purge resonates so powerfully, even though its core concept is obviously fantastical.
Right, the 12 hours annually where all crime is legal,
Hmm.
ostensibly for societal catharsis, but secretly, as the plot reveals, for population control specifically, eliminating the poor and marginalized.
Exactly. And sociologist Lester Andrus weighed in on this, noting that the resonance isn't just about the violence itself, it's about how it mirrors current social class realities, where the rich often feel, or perhaps are, effectively immune to many problems facing average citizens.
Can you give an example of that immunity?
Well, think about the 2008 financial crisis.
Hmm.
Andrus points out that the white-collar financial players whose decisions caused immense suffering for millions of people losing homes, jobs, life savings were rarely, if ever, punished in any significant, open, or painful way. They were, in effect, committing mass economic crimes with relative immunity.
And in the purge, that immunity is physicalized, made literal. The wealthy live in these heavily fortified homes, surrounded by state-of-the-art surveillance and private security systems. They are isolated, protected.
And completely removed from the street-level violence that the purge itself is designed to unleash, primarily targeting the less affluent segments of society who can't afford such protection.
The film's underlying political critique seems quite sharp in that respect. But what Andrus finds sociologically unsound, apparently, is the core idea that people would just save up all their rage for one organized night of mayhem.
Yeah, he argues the human dynamic is far more complex than that. People don't typically operate like pressure cookers, just waiting to explode on cue.
So instead of a mass kill fest, how does Andrus predict a real-life purge scenario would actually unfold, sociologically speaking?
He predicts collective resistance. Instead of every individual suddenly becoming a feral killer, he suggests it's far more likely that large groups of average, normally law-abiding people would gather together
Where?
in defensible spaces, maybe local parks, churches, secure neighborhood cul-de-sacs, and they would band together to actively defy the spirit of the purge. They would likely enforce their own sense of accountability and community protection, rejecting the state-sanctioned violence.
So community and cooperation rather than chaos.
That collective action, Andrus argues, is sociologically a far more likely human response to widespread, mandated lawlessness than universal, individualized murderous intent.
Okay, so if the purge explores class-based violence in a potential scarcity future, the classic film Soylent Green, which was actually set in the now-past year of 2022, that provided a terrifying Malthusian prophecy that turned out to be prescient in several really disturbing ways.
It really did. The film depicted a world absolutely buckling under Malthusian overpopulation New York City, crammed with 40 million people happening amid catastrophic environmental decline and resource exhaustion.
And while the film obviously got specific details wrong, it missed the massive tech revolution, it didn't foresee the rise of global feminism, it seemed to nail some of the macro trends that really define our modern crises, didn't it?
Absolutely. Most importantly, perhaps, it predicted the reality of global warming with surprising accuracy. The film's depiction of the greenhouse effect, these chronic, suffocating heat waves, collapsing food production, specifically mentioning the dying oceans.
That must have felt like distant science fiction back in 1973.
Completely. But now, those are core anxieties of the 21st century. They're headlines, not fiction.
And the income inequality depicted in the film is, well, shockingly accurate to our current era, too. The film shows the stark, brutal disparity between the very rich living in secure, air-conditioned splendor with access to luxuries like clean water and natural food, and the destitute masses living in utter squalor.
And that is sadly reflected today, isn't it, in major U.S. cities like San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles. You see these vast, visible tent cities and mass homelessness existing literally alongside unimaginable wealth. It just reinforces the film's vision of pervasive, inescapable class disparity.
But perhaps the most morally jarring prediction looking back is the normalization of assisted suicide. The film's thanatorium scenes, where the sick, the elderly, or sometimes just the despairing line up for this serene, state-assisted death. That's no longer a moral horror unique to dystopian sci-fi, is it?
No, it isn't. Euthanasia and doctor-prescribed death are now legalized realities in several nations and quite a few U.S. states. And the criteria often extend to the chronically sick or those suffering from profound psychological despair.
And the utilitarian logic.
Yeah, the process sometimes includes mechanisms for post-death organ harvesting, which really echoes the cold utilitarian logic you see in the dystopia. The moral landscape around end-of-life choices has significantly shifted since 1973.
Even the kind of gross final treatment of dead bodies in the film being removed unceremoniously by garbage trucks and then liquefied or composted, that actually mirrors some modern green disposition methods available today.
That's right. Things like alkaline hydrolysis, which is liquefaction, or natural organic reduction, which is essentially composting for fertilizer.
Mhm.
These are real options now.
So while the film's climax, the horrifying revelation that the food wafer Soylent Green is made of people, is obviously the most famous and shocking element, the true accuracy of the film arguably lies less in the specific cannibalism plot point and more in its depiction of pervasive classism, the constant intrusion and lack of privacy due to crowding, and the normalization of desperate moral compromises that overpopulation and environmental collapse seem to impose. The source material book, Make Room, apparently focused even more on those aspects.
Yes, and those aspects feel incredibly relevant today, perhaps even more so than the shock ending.
Okay, shifting back from these grim, fictional, and historical predictions to contemporary policy, our sources highlight a major and arguably quite immoral gap in current climate policy debates: the role of population growth itself.
Yeah, it's often called the elephant in the room of climate talks. There's a strong scientific consensus confirming that population growth, alongside economic growth, remains one of the two primary drivers of increasing global CO2 emissions.
Two primary drivers.
Yet, it is largely ignored, or at least significantly downplayed, in major international agreements. For instance, the sources note that discussion of population policy made basically no appearance in the final agreement text of the COP26 Climate Summit.
Why is it ignored? It seems like a fundamental factor given its undeniable impact on resource consumption and emissions.
Well, it's incredibly politically fraught, isn't it? Discussions about population, let alone population control, immediately raise the specter of historical human rights abuses, coercive policies, particularly targeting women and minorities. It's a very sensitive topic.
Understandably so.
However, climate ethicists argue that ignoring population policy entirely is morally irresponsible. They say it falls short of offering a clear and reasonably certain pathway to avoiding dangerous climate change. There is apparently a scientific consensus that the global population must be stabilized and ideally gradually reduced over the long term.
But crucially,
this must be achieved within a framework that absolutely ensures social integrity and upholds human rights. That's non-negotiable.
so the real challenge then is separating ethical, acceptable policy options from those historical, unacceptable human rights abuses. We need to distinguish very clearly between Malthus's brutal positive checks or coercive state action and ethical preventative checks.
Absolutely. And the consensus among ethicists, according to our sources, is robustly in favor of what are termed choice-enhancing policies. These are the preventative checks. They aim to reduce fertility rates, but do so while fully respecting human rights and individual autonomy. We absolutely must avoid punitive measures.
Because those have historically led to
Forced sterilizations, highly coercive one-child policies, discrimination, and terrible human rights violations. History is littered with examples we must not repeat.
Okay, so what are the core consensual solutions, the ones that align with human rights, that the ethicists support?
There seem to be two main pillars. First and foremost, securing universal access to modern contraception methods that are proven safe and effective. This provides individuals, particularly women, with the autonomy to make informed choices about their own reproductive future and family size.
And the second.
Providing equal rights, and particularly equal educational and economic opportunities for women globally. Studies consistently show, again and again, that as women's rights, literacy, and access to education and careers increase, fertility rates tend to decrease voluntarily and significantly.
Empowering women lowers birth rates naturally.
That's the consistent finding. There's also considerable ethical support, apparently, for soft government policies, things like incentives for smaller families, or perhaps disincentives for very large ones, but very little to absolutely no support for any measures that are coercive or punitive in nature.
Right. And the ethical discussion, importantly, needs to expand beyond just human interests, doesn't it?
Yes, it's a critical point raised. We have to start considering non-human interests, which often get completely overlooked when we discuss resource allocation purely in human terms. We need to somehow balance human reproductive rights and responsibilities against the rights of other species to simply exist.
That concept, justice beyond humanity, means we have to consider how sheer human population size contributes to anthropogenic extinction, right? Where human actions literally overwhelm global ecosystems and drive other species out of existence.
Exactly. It presents a critical hurdle for modern policymakers. How do we ensure that human numbers, and perhaps more importantly, human consumption levels, don't crowd out the flourishing of life in all its diverse forms? Because ultimately, that biodiversity determines the health and long-term sustainability of the entire planet, including for ourselves. #outro patient.
Well, this deep dive has certainly spanned centuries and moral universes, hasn't it? We've explored this whole spectrum of responses to resource crisis, from the literal engineered solution of lab-grown human protein, navigating the really bizarre taboos of technical cannibalism.
Right, all the way to the figurative, savage satire of Swift's Mamasan proposal, acting as a warning from history.
We've seen how our most visceral dystopian visions, from the engineered social violence of the Purge to the environmental collapse, and, frankly, the normalized despair of Soylent Green, how they mirror some startling realities of modern income inequality and the difficult moral compromises being made today. And the central tension, it seems, remains really sharp. Are we seeking genuine systemic change that addresses the root causes of our unsustainable demands on the planet? Or are we simply pursuing profitable technological reforms that, perhaps through strategies like silent reformulation, actually perpetuate the cultural status quo while maximizing that impact return of the capital employed?
And that, I think, is the ultimate provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry forward. The food industry is actively shifting toward this silent reformulation, quietly making major changes to our food systems, partly to avoid public confrontation and consumer panic. So, if ethical, sustainable food systems are truly necessary for planetary survival, does the avoidance of open public debate, the industry's apparent desire for silence, does that ultimately compromise the goal of achieving a truly just and informed food transition?
A critical question indeed for a society trying to navigate its engineered future. If you appreciated this deep dive into the ethics and economics of our engineered world, please remember to subscribe, like, and comment to share your perspective on these complex issues.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.